There we are.
Oh, hello. It's Trish Roberts, and this is Dee Dee River. She's joining me tonight, and we thought that we would talk about technology and ethics. And if anybody can hear us okay, just leave a little comment. And so I wanted to start with, I was just talking to Dee Dee earlier today, and I read this report, I read this article about...
Steve Evans.
Hi, Stevie. I read this report about in South Korea, there's there's a group of scientists who are doing some research on killer robots, you know, just like Terminator robots. And
that's what we need.
Yeah, that's what we need. And apparently there's there's been a lot of outcry from other scientists about this. And, you know, we talked about...
basically, I mean, that issue of an outcry of science, of other scientists is what brought us to the conversation.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be fairly rare when scientists actually make an outcry about something. Yeah. I think the last time that happened was around genetic engineering, where they actually had a halt to genetic engineering for a while. Because after they invented genetic engineering, they were going ahead and somebody found one of their students was using a vector that was, I think it was a human cancer gene into a simian virus, and somebody said, that's not a really good idea.
No.
And so they said, maybe we should slow down and think about this.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's interesting you should say that about when we did a podcast on the lab meat. There was these so-called immortal cells. You know how there's a talk about lab meat, which I have numerous issues with. The most important one is the animal exploitation that still goes on, and there's some other issues too. And I'll leave a podcast link to that particular thing about lab meat. But the thing we were talking, the immortal cell line thing.
They're basically cancer cells. They're cells which will reproduce continually, and they tend to be used for cell lines because of that.
And they can go, they've actually found all sorts of weird...
Basically,
things.
When you put some sort of a cell line and you start it out, it starts out reproducing as the cell line from a certain person, and they name them for that person that it started out as. And after a little while, they almost always turn into something else.
So they're really not immortal.
So well, basically, the problem is when you're reproducing cell lines, you introduce impurities, and when you're basically, you can end up creating the cell line of some other thing, and that's what almost always happens with cell lines.
Anyway, we're getting off the track. Yeah. I'm sorry, I've thrown us off the track.
It's just one of those technological things.
Yeah, I've just thrown us off the track, though. We were talking about this South Korean thing and the killer robots that they're doing research on, and then the outcry from all these scientists. We talked about how,
why do they do that kind of thing?
Yeah, and we talked about why, that there is a sort of a lack of a moral compass or ethics in relation to technology, and that's sort of under the umbrella of capitalism, because it's almost like anything that is seen as profitable. Doesn't matter if it's sort of got a lot of problems ethically. That it tends to go ahead, and the military is a great example of that. And so these killer robots, that's a sort of an example. But anyway, was there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Basically about that.
Sweet?
That was basically it's not only the capitalist thing that you can make money out of it, but scientist Migalina, hi Migalina, there's not only the thing that you can make money out of this, and so capitalism loves pursuing these things, but scientists love these things because just being able to do this is special, and scientists have a term, technologically sweet, or technically sweet, and one of the things that was used for was the nuclear bombs, to find that you could create nuclear fission.
Did you want to talk about that? The origins of that in World War II?
That's a good example in relation to the ethics as well, because
Hi, Beverly. Not
only did people do it because it was technologically sweet, but there was actually, as in a lot of science at the time, Germany had been a center for a lot of different research, not only psychiatry and psychology and so on, but physics. And there were a lot of physicists from all over the world that went to Germany and were studying nuclear physics, basically. And they got the idea that nuclear fission was possible. And they decided not to do anything, or not to really say very much about that. And they all kind of had a little pact, because they realized that if they made nuclear bombs, this was going to be a problem.
This is in Germany?
This was in Germany at the time. And when the Nazis took over, a lot of the scientists, like a lot of the psychologists and psychiatrists, all left Germany. And not all of them, obviously, but many of them. And many of them went to the United States. But as Hitler came into power, the scientists, particularly in the United States, became really concerned that the physicists who were still in Germany would pursue the development of an atomic bomb. And so people like Albert Einstein wrote a letter, and a number of other nuclear scientists and famous scientists. Leo Szilard was one of the people who was key in that. And he was a Hungarian physicist who was living in the United States at the time. And Leo Szilard, I think, really was pushing for the United States to develop a nuclear bomb, because he was very worried that the Germans would develop a nuclear bomb.
Right.
As it turned out, the German physicists mostly decided to kind of keep the information to themselves and not to develop the bomb, and to be a bit obstructionist even. And so Hitler's bomb really, they had a bomb project, but it really didn't go anywhere.
Right.
And when people like Szilard, who was working actively on creating the bomb in Los Alamos, realized this, a number of the scientists said, okay, they're not doing this, let's stop. And he became one of the main anti-nuclear protesters among scientists, and he tried to organize scientists against the nuclear thing.
Right.
But, I mean, that's an example where there were enough scientists in Germany who decided that not to try and develop the bomb there.
Right.
But there were enough fearful scientists in the United States. They developed the bomb.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, once something like this is developed, and I mean, you had people like Oppenheimer, who was doing it because it was technologically sweet.
Yeah,
that term,
So
really
he didn't
came
have
from
a
that
problem,
period.
Oppenheimer, or he did later, didn't he?
He did later, but I mean, it was like he was wrapped with it. It was like he had that, thing where he saw the first nuclear explosion and was reciting things from the Bhagavad Gita. You know,
Jeez
we have seen God brighter than 1,000 suns. You know, that expression comes from the Bhagavad Gita, because Oppenheimer was actually reciting it when the first bomb went off.
Oh no, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
No, in New Mexico.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They had a couple of tests in New Mexico before they dropped it.
Yeah.
On Japan.
Right.
And of course, there were scientists in Los Alamos who had been working on the bomb who realized that Japan had effectively already indicated it wanted to surrender. But the military wanted to push ahead and drop the bombs. And this created
it was a massive experiment. It was an experiment.
It was an experiment, but it's an example of the way once these technological things get out, even though the scientists thought, oh, what a fabulous thing.
People have to use them.
It's technologically sweet. From the military standpoint, it's not technologically sweet. It's a weapon.
Yeah, that's right.
And we want to try it. We want to use it.
And they continued. Interestingly, the U.S., the military, continued to, there's an Empire Files episode where it talks about the experimenting on soldiers and actually exploding nuclear bombs with soldiers in range, even though I'm pretty sure they knew, and they also used animals in range in the Marshall Islands and also elsewhere.
And in New Mexico and in Australia.
In Maralinga. Yeah, there was they were experimenting using soldiers in these nuclear blasts.
Yeah, and they experiment with nerve gas. They did that in New Mexico also, where they waited until the wind was in the right direction, and it wiped out herds of sheep and some Native Americans, mainly Apache, who were had their tribal reservation down there.
And they knew exactly what they were doing.
And they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, and they knew exactly what they were doing in the Marshall Islands. They actually, after they did these blasts, they then started testing on the people that were in that area to see the effects. I mean, this is amazing. Anyway, you can see that actually in the documentary by with John Pilger's documentary, The Coming War on China, which is very interesting. And
that Abby Martin one that you mentioned,
Excuse me.
I mean, they talked to some of the people whose
sorry, it's a little homage to
where
Palestine.
they had ships off of the coast, and they told them to come in close to the bomb, where they would be certain to be exposed to radiation.
Oh, yeah, charming. Anyway, I'll put
Empire File.
Oh, yeah, I'll put links to those two. It's really horrific, actually. But anyway, So Didi, we also. Sorry, go on, Didi.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing with the way the military will take that stuff. I mean, they will use it unethically. But they also just try and buy into any kind of technology that they think they might be able to use.
Yeah.
I mean, for instance, oh God, what's his name? The fellow who did the dolphin research into dolphin language. I mean, he came out and spoke to us at one point, and they talked about how they felt they were being really clever in going to the military to get funding for dolphin research, to learn how to talk to the dolphins.
Right.
And he said, the way we bought into that was we said to the military that if aliens ever come to Earth, it will be important for us to learn to speak to the aliens before the Russians can speak to the aliens.
Lord.
And so the best practice we would have in learning to speak to aliens is learning to speak to dolphins. Right. Don't you want to fund the dolphin research, language research?
Right.
And the military did. And of course, the military then thought, if we can speak to dolphins, we can train dolphins to carry bombs and mines to ships, which, of course, that's where the military went with it.
It all goes sideways.
It all goes sideways, always.
Actually, and we were talking about a few months ago, I saw this really excellent early documentary. It was like it was black and white documentary about corporations being involved in profiting, U.S. corporations profiting during the World War II with the Nazis. Yeah. And you might like to talk about that, Didi.
Well, okay, yeah. One of the things, a lot of U.S. companies invested in Germany. And one of the reasons was because Hitler was, he basically broke up trade unions. He made strikes illegal. And so...
Before you go on, yeah, it's true. I think that might be Rocco. Rocco, that's true, yeah. The Navy actually does tremendous damage to marine life. They do these sonic sounding things that are absolutely ear-splitting and I think just drives marine life, and also drives them a bit mad, and also blasts and things underwater. They're doing absolutely dreadful things to marine life.
Areas.
Yeah. And anyway, sorry, but go on about the corporations and the Nazis, U.S. corporations.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. During that time, I mean, because the Nazis were so anti-union, and it was during the Depression, they saw this as a real opportunity, and they could make more money in Germany than they could in the United States. And so they built factories in Germany. And this was Ford and General Motors and Coca-Cola and a whole lot of...
Coca-Cola too?
Coca-Cola too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And they were making heaps of money there.
Standard Oil?
Standard Oil, well, as Hitler became more powerful, they thought, oh, well, great. They weren't worried too much about the racism because a lot of them were racist, like Henry Ford. Yeah. And a lot of them were anti-Semitic. But they really liked the idea that Germany was going to attack the USSR. Right. Because that was the bastion of communism, and communism is the opposite of capitalism. Yeah. And so if they crushed the USSR, that was great. So even though they could see war was coming, they were happy to fuel the war. Right. And so General Motors and Ford and stuff made tanks and made trucks and made all these things.
In Germany?
In Germany. Yeah. And in factories in Germany. And not only made them in Germany, but made them in America and sent them to Germany. Right. And Standard Oil provided fuel, lots of fuel, because they knew they were going to need fuel. Yeah. And they were developing, IBM did things for the command and control, well, for Auschwitz, but also for
isn't that special?
Links between the bombers and the tanks, and communication things. Yeah. So IBM was in on that too. Standard Oil was in on that.
IG Farben, which turned out to be Bayer. Bayer, they developed the gas that
Zyklon
B that for the gas chambers.
For the gas chambers.
I mean, that's charming. This is an example, and if we want to know where the rot was setting in, it probably was setting in before this, but I mean, you can see the rot of capitalism setting in when U.S. corporations...
The rot set in
long before that, but you can see a very obvious setting in of rot during the World War II, when there's all this rah-rah, America against the Nazis, and meanwhile these
the Americans weren't against the Nazis.
Oh, sorry, eventually they were. Eventually. When it became convenient, the U.S. joined in. But, these U.S. corporations were happily profiting. In fact, General Motors, I think it was, actually, at the end of the war, asked for compensation because their factory was blown up in Germany.
And they got compensation.
So, here's U.S. corporations.
Their factories in Germany producing trucks and tanks for the Nazis.
Germans. Yeah. So, these corporations were happily, Standard Oil and And I mentioned IG Farben, which became Bayer later on. They actually made, the gas for the gas chambers.
Okay. There's a couple of interesting links there.
And none of them went to prison.
Yeah.
None of them. It was all just fine.
There was no prosecution
and look at the line between here and now, and how it's a corporate coup d'état. So. I mean, they would do, the rot is the line to the rot is a long, long line, isn't it, Didi?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and now they're people.
Money.
Corporations
you make
are
money
people.
Wherever you can.
Yeah.
But there's some interesting
That's
links.
Capitalism
I mean,
for you.
one of the interesting links to war now that's going on in the Middle East is that Hitler developed the idea of the Blitzkrieg, or the lightning war. And that's really just shock and awe. Is the first example of that. You go in there and, really fast, take over the country, destroy the enemy, take over the country, and your war is over in a matter of weeks.
Who did that? The Germans?
Nazis.
Oh, they came up with the Blitzkrieg. Oh, okay.
Yeah, the lightning war.
Right.
And that's where they had the bombers and the tanks and all the trucks.
Yeah.
That was like where they really needed General Motors and Ford and Chevron, Standard Oil. I mean, it's all the same.
Standard Oil actually developed a synthetic oil for the Nazis.
They helped,
didn't they?
Yeah.
A synthetic oil to help them. Yeah. Like, isn't that amazing?
And also the lead additives that they needed.
Yeah, that's right. Who did Standard Oil become?
Standard Oil is still Standard Oil.
Oh, it's still Standard Oil.
Chevron.
Oh, Chevron. Okay.
It's also Texaco. I mean, it's the breakup of the big U.S. oil thing is Exxon, Esso, Standard Oil, Caltex.
Amco.
That's all the same, basically. They have interlocking boards.
This is a nice light topic for the morning, isn't it, folks? We're in Australia here, so it's
another
actually
interesting
nighttime.
link. The reason they needed synthetic petrol is because when petrol was invented, really, and they started having petrol ships and cars and so on, most of the oil reserves, most of the oil in the world, petroleum in the world, came from the United States, from around Pennsylvania. And the only other real source at that time was the Caspian Sea. And that was one of Hitler's also objectives, is to take over Russia and get a source of oil. So he had his own source of oil because Germany doesn't have any oil, and nowhere in Europe does. But it's also interesting that that's where, like the thing where they put in the Shah of Persia is, when they put in the Shah, that was basically a move by Standard Oil to get a much bigger share of Iranian oil and to increase their holdings in the Gulf. And this was in the years before Aramco, the American Arabian oil company, which they did a deal with the Saudis, where they would basically support the Saudis and give them military equipment, and they would be part owners of the oil and that kind of stuff.
Let's talk briefly just about the Saudis and Wahhabism, because a lot of people may not be aware about how the U.S. uses Wahhabism as a political tool. And how about we do that, Didi?
Okay,
talk a little bit about
the
that.
Wahhabi sect, the
Saudi Arabia
family,
is the, you'd be aware, it's one of the biggest allies of the United States, and it's a massive human rights abuser.
And is one of the biggest consumers of U.S. military stuff. It buys billions of dollars,
and right now it's conducting, with U.S. backing and help, and even refueling planes and everything. Saudi Arabia is committing a genocide in Yemen, and one child every 10 minutes is being killed. Is dying from cholera and starvation and malnutrition because the U.S. is backing the Saudi family in their genocide in Yemen. And part of that is to do with wanting to control the bay, and also water resources are very scarce in Saudi Arabia, so that's part of it. And also, they don't want a flourishing they don't want a democracy, any sort of democracy that was starting to happen in Yemen. They don't want that happening.
The Houthi thing is a political movement.
Yeah.
People sometimes confuse it as something ethnic, but it's actually a political movement.
So anyway, they're committing a genocide in Yemen, and the U.S. is backing that. So when you hear this nonsense about the U.S. empire going into Syria for humanitarian reasons, you know that's just rubbish.
Nonsense.
Because they're currently, there's a whole stack of things that they've been involved in, that killing 500,000 children during the early 90s in the Iraq with sanctions and stuff, and also supporting Israel in their killing of Palestinians. And giving them lots and lots of millions and millions of dollars and everything in their apartheid state, and this genocide in Yemen backing that, and a whole host of other things. So anyway, just this humanitarian reasons thing is just nonsense. But anyway, let's get back to Saudi Arabia
going back
Wahhabism.
into the Saudi thing. The Saud family started out as a principality. At one point, there were 4 main kingdoms in what is now Saudi Arabia, and the Hashemites were the people who had the kingdom, which was Mecca and Medina, the 2 holy cities of Islam. And they made the deal with the British, which helped overthrow the Turks. And anyway, the Saudis took over. They made a deal with the Wahhabi religious group, who were a very extreme, very kind of fundamentalist sect of Islam. And the Sunnis actually considered them heretics, although the
most rejected,
the Wahhabi consider themselves the real Sunnis and that kind of stuff. But they were extreme enough that they did things like destroy the tombs of the prophets' families. Anyway, it has been that link between the Saud family, which basically are absolute monarchs, but they could be seen as excessive and stuff, but they could get the Muslim tribespeople and so on side by connecting with the Wahhabi. And their conquest then supported the Wahhabi in imposing their idea of Islam on other Islamic people. And so when they conquered Mecca and Medina, they ended up creating Saudi Arabia and started to impose Wahhabism on all of Saudi Arabia, and to try and promote this as the real Islam.
And how did the U.S. get
the U.S. had this deal over the oil with the Saudi family, which allowed the Sauds, who are absolute monarchs. There is no constitutional monarchy. They're absolute monarchs. And their deals with the Wahhabi has meant that they've had the very restrictive form of Islam with women not being able to drive, no movie theaters, all of that kind of stuff, people being headed, all of that fun stuff. But later on, when the Russians, going to the Cold War, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the U.S. went in and tried to do this.
When was that, Russians invading Afghanistan?
Oh, God, when was it?
80s?
It was the 70s, I think.
70s, okay. Yeah.
70, was it 79 or 81, somewhere around in there. And the Russians invaded there. The U.S. decided to try and back the Mujahideen to attack the
and just remember, Reagan invited the Mujahideen to come and see them in the White House,
and at that time,
celebrating them as
and at that time, what's his name was best friends, who's the great enemy of the United States, the terrorist.
Oh, you mean from Iraq?
No, they
Saddam
killed
Hussein.
him. No.
They've knocked off a lot of people. Is this in Saudi Arabia?
No. Yeah, Saudi Arabia. He's the head of Al Qaeda.
They had Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden was great friends. They had pictures of him with the heads of the CIA and all this sort of stuff. And he was helping to organize the Mujahideen. But the U.S., being the U.S., didn't want to pay for all of the help. And they went to their great friend and supporter, Saudi Arabia, and said, you pay for half of it.
Right.
And so the king of Saudi Arabia said, okay, we have to pay for half of it, but I don't personally want to have to pay for it. And since I own the country, that means the country doesn't want to have to pay for it. So I'll go to my allies, the Wahhabi, and they can take up a collection in all of the mosques and promote this idea of jihad, that this is an Islamic country that's been attacked, and under jihad we owe it to our brothers to stand in solidarity and fight the infidels.
Right.
And so this really started the jihadist movement, and the Wahhabi, the money was collected and the Wahhabi sent people over there.
Can we just stop for a second with the jihad thing? That's actually an internal transformation too. The word jihad is often sort of distorted.
In Islam, as far as I know it, and that's having studied a bit in Iran, jihad has sort of 4 levels. It is a battle. The most overt form is a physical battle, but then there's the battle with wealth, the battle with knowledge, and that's, you would use your wealth to try and spread Islam. You would use your knowledge and your ability, your science, to try and spread Islam. And the highest form of jihad is jihad with yourself, within.
Anyway, so that's just a different sort of aspect to that word jihad. But it's often, sort of, go on.
But the jihadists, the ones the Wahhabi were doing, they were also using this as a way of spreading Wahhabism. And so they sent people over and created madrasas in Pakistan and ultimately in southern Afghanistan. And out of that came the Taliban.
Right.
And the Taliban actually ended up going to war after they got rid of Russia, going to war with the Mujahideen, which were mainly northern Afghanis, and ultimately won that war just before 9/11.
Right.
But they were at war as a civil war for 10 years after the Russians left.
Yeah, right.
And so Afghanistan had nothing but war, and the ultimate thing was the imposition of the Taliban on Afghanistan. And when I knew Afghanistan, when I was there in the 70s and that kind of stuff, women weren't wearing burqas and weren't wearing all that kind of stuff. It was fairly liberal in many ways. I mean, yes, there was religion. Yes, some people followed it fairly strictly, but I mean, they had their own traditions. There were a lot of different tribal groups, and it was a very, very different place.
Yeah, and so, you walked across, Didi walked across Iran, in what year was that, Didi?
1972, I think.
1972, she walked right across Iran. And how did you find Iran?
Incredibly friendly, lovely, lovely, lovely people.
Yeah.
I found I was brought into people's homes and invited in. At the time, I was learning Farsi and also studying Islam, and. And
Iran today, I mean, I mention Iran because, you hardly really hear anything about what it's really like. But, Iran is comprised mostly of people under 35 years old, It's actually a very, very friendly place. But all you hear about is that it's some sort of absolutely monstrous, evil place. And that's what they want, the empire wants you to believe, so eventually they can invade it, and that's what they intend to do. And that's why Pompeo and what's his name, John Bolton, the neocon warmongers, they both want to invade Iran. So let's remember that when
they all want to.
They all want to, but I mean those
Hillary
two,
Clinton, the whole lot.
Those two were brought into the sort of pack, you might say, to specifically to have invade Iran. But anyway,
but they've hated Iran ever since they got rid of the Shah.
Yeah, ever since the Shah was overthrown, they've had a sort of a big axe to grind. It's like you shouldn't be interfering with our meddling in countries. 81 countries since 1946 that the U.S. has meddled in and overthrown governments.
Well, they basically overthrew a democracy to put the Shah in.
Yeah.
And a large part of that was that the U.S. wanted a bigger share of the oil fields in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
And they wanted a bigger share of oil, specifically in Iran, because the British had been the people who initially established the oil fields in Iraq and had the deals with Iran and so on. They were the people, and had the Gulf states. All of those were under treaty to the British.
Yeah, I mean, democracies, as I'm sure you would all know, democracies and the U.S. empire just don't mix. They don't want democracies to have to deal with. They want to install dictators, and so that they can deal with. They're easy to deal with.
They've got one person to deal with, and they can deal with them for decades.
Yeah. I mean, they've been aiming. Syria is a secular country, and they want these countries to end up controlled chaos. You would all understand this, so that they can manipulate it and do whatever and take resources and
it's why
all of that.
The U.S. has always supported dictators in places like,
always.
Chile and Nicaragua as well. All through Latin America, you see, people like General Pinochet and General Somoza, all these nice generals who they've effectively put in and kept in power until somebody finally gets rid of them.
Yes.
The people finally managed to get rid of them.
Yeah, and they're still meddling in Latin
Indonesia,
America.
all over the world.
Poor old Latin America is constantly, the U.S. is constantly meddling in Latin America and trying to overthrow, in some way, whether funding opposition or whatever, democratically elected governments. It's just unending.
And in Southeast Asia,
Anyway.
I mean, Indonesia. The Vietnam thing was about the Diem regime.
So this whole thing is spreading freedom and democracy is much nonsense as the going into countries for humanitarian reasons.
They spread dictatorships.
They're all just empty words used to, as part of the big propaganda campaign. But you probably all know this anyway. And anyway, so Didi, just talking about Wahhabism again, and let's go back to Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And because Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia, by the way, is going to have a nuclear program at some point, and that's going to be just so much fun.
Yeah.
Because they're, they're really, really frightening how it's a family, basically running the whole country.
Yes, one family.
And Mohammed bin Salman has actually been knocking off or actually getting rid of a lot of his family members. It's like the Roman Empire. It's like the Roman Empire there. They're all stabbing one another in the back. But Mohammed bin Salman is sort of... And may I just say, Mohammed bin Salman recently came to New York, or he might even still be there, and all these groups, corporations like Google and all these things, all these different corporations, and Arianna Huffington and just a bunch of people all flocked to Mohammed bin Salman because they can courting him basically, because it's a business opportunity. Forget that he's got a genocide happening in Yemen right now, backed by the U.S. That's not an issue, right?
Yeah.
They
Yemen
just
is
see
the biggest humanitarian disaster happening in the world.
Yeah. And so all these different corporations, big corporations, were flocking to him in New York just recently. Yeah. And this just shows this is capitalism. Just absolutely, they do not, it's all about profit, and who gives a toss about the, like the Yemenis, who are one child dying every 10 minutes of famine and malnutrition and disease. And this is all a US-backed genocide, helping the Saudis, refueling their planes as they bomb infrastructure and all of that, hospitals and everything in Yemen, literally refueling planes.
This is the poorest country, one of the poorest countries
happening
in the
right
world.
now.
The poorest Islamic majority country in the world.
Yeah.
And it's all happening now.
Yeah, and this is over water.
It's been happening, that's 3 years. They just had the anniversary. It's been going on for 3 years now.
Yeah. And where do you really hear much about it, really? I mean, it's only just recently there was a bill introduced which they knew was never going to pass. And forgive me when I'm going to criticize Bernie Sanders. He introduced this bill, but this has been going on for 3 years. What took him so long, right? And he probably knew it wasn't going to pass anyway. And it didn't. Why didn't it pass? Why is it okay that the US is backing a genocide in Yemen? Why is that okay? And this is the amazing thing.
And not only backing, they're actually actively participating.
Yeah, actively participating.
I mean,
and they have had troops on the ground. And listen, this is another thing too. The US, I was going to say something about Israel. Oh, never mind.
Well, I mean, they've been backing Israel
they've been
forever.
backing Israel.
That's an obscene thing.
Yeah.
They sit there, and the mainstream media keeps repeating this garbage propaganda that Russia has blocked, used their veto power to block the Security Council.
Oh, no, that's what I was going to say.
Yes, they block the Security Council. They block the U.S. from trying to demand the UN back the U.S. intervention in Syria. Yeah. And yet the U.S. has blocked virtually every measure the UN has done about Israel's treatment of Palestine. And it's like 126 or something things that the UN has done. And this has been not only in the Security Council, but in the General Assembly, where the vast majority of nations in the world have condemned and demanded change in Israel, and an end to the apartheid state and the end to the occupation of Palestine. And yet the U.S. will block it every single time. And they never talk about the U.S.'s use of veto power in relation to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was a bill that Tulsi Gabbard was introduced. I don't think it passed, but it was actually a bill to stop supporting terrorism. Now, you would think, right, a bill that is, for the U.S. to stop supporting terrorism would just be a no-brainer. Well, the fact that she even had to introduce a bill like that, right? I mean, wow. And then two, I don't think it passed. And do you hear about this in the mainstream media? No, this was last year. So it's like, wow, it's so out there and beyond. But anyway, we were so anyway, Mohammed bin Salman, he's the toast of the town, right? And everybody wants him to put money into this and that. So, this is capitalism for you. Talking about, we were talking about the lack of ethics in relation to technology. Well, the complete lack of anything, moral centers and ethics in relation to capitalism. Just, it is destined to be a big gaping, sucking, spiritual-less, hole, which we all will get sucked into because it's all about profit and not about people.
It's always a zero-sum game. They talk about competition giving us all these benefits. Well, the thing about competition is somebody wins. And when somebody wins, everybody else loses. I mean, look at a game of Monopoly. How much fun is it when one person ends up having all the money and all of the property? They might try and keep it going by lending people some money. But I mean, it's no fun for anybody else anymore. Yeah. And I mean, you look at the concentration of wealth, and it's concentrating at an outrageous.
Yeah. 3 people now, I think, own more than 90% of the U.S. population. And Jeff Bezos has become, like Lord Bezos, basically. He's like got $100 billion, and he's basically, people that work for him are on food stamps.
Yeah.
And Uber is basically destroying the basically the jobs of cab drivers in New York, and they're killing themselves at a tremendous rate.
And Uber is making next to nothing.
Yeah, and Uber is actually sort of lobbying Congress. It's like, and gets to they get to duck all the regulations. This is sort of like basically, and
is it Uber that's Saudi?
I think Uber might be related. I think Uber is Saudi. I think it's a Saudi investment. Anyway, but did we want to say anything more about Wahhabism? Because this is, as I said, Wahhabism is used by the U.S. empire as a tool, and because the idea is to end up destroying any secular states, and also, the chaos that is caused by it, the extreme, the extremeness of it, which a lot of Muslims reject. It's a distortion, really, isn't it? Wahhabism.
It's an absolute distortion.
Yeah. Well, so is there anything else you wanted to say about Saudi Arabia? Sorry.
Saudi Arabia is, of course, one of the greatest funders of the really extreme fundamentalist Islamic terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and all of these things, which the U.S. call moderate rebels, and also funds and backs and sells arms to.
Yeah.
And really, ISIS it's a bit of a revolving door with these other groups, and ISIS. The arms just end up there. People end up there. If ISIS looks like it's going downhill, they'll move to one of the other groups. But they're basically kind of paramilitary groups who use Islam as an excuse.
Yeah. In fact, somebody was saying how, I think it was one of the journalists said that
they Islamic at all about them.
No, but they don't even know, they barely know anything about
the Quran.
The Quran. Barely know anything. And so, it's sort of like it's just kind of something they've attached to a lot of these, because they're disenfranchised. And why wouldn't you be when your countries are being destroyed and bombed the bejesus? And anyway. But anyhow, I think we probably we've rambled a bit, because we were speaking about technology and ethics. Then we talked about the nuclear bomb and the origins of that, and then we went to the corporations, U.S. corporations profiting from during the World War II. That's fabulous. And I'll leave it. Hang on, Didi. I'll leave a link to the documentary, which is really fascinating. I mean, that just shows you the rot was setting in with corporations way back then and before.
Yeah, but I wanted to go back into the technology thing just for a minute and say it's interesting to see how technology has interacted, and the military has interacted with the internet, because the people say that the U.S. military started the internet with DARPA.
Yeah.
And to a degree that's true, except the U.S. military, of course, never invents any of these things. The U.S. military uses the invention for itself.
Yeah.
And, of course, they used the linking of computers.
Yeah.
But there was ARPA, there was the institutional thing, and right from the beginning there were universities talking too, which ended up developing into the internet we know. But paradoxically, at the same time that level of freedom and connection and communication was happening within the wider world, and people saw this as liberating, the U.S. government and the military saw the potential military and control applications, and have used it for surveillance.
Yeah.
To where they follow everybody.
I actually listened to a Robbie Martin podcast, and somebody, I forget what his name, he's written a book, and I'll leave a link to that. actually said that it really actually originally it was part meant also to be a surveillance thing right from the start,
right from
the internet.
Start, yeah.
So in fact, it's actually developed in the exact way that they probably hoped it would. I don't think they sort of engineered it to. I don't think they were clever enough to have it eventuate like this. But you know, it actually has become the internet exactly what they really intended it to be. The military intended it to be. And the other thing. Oh, I've forgotten what I was going to say. Go on. I'm a little bit.
Anyway, you know, like it is. Yeah, they've
So
managed to use it, and then they're also working on, as more and more things get linked to the net. There's more and more possibility for using and weaponizing and using it in ways that can shut down things at important times. Or,
and this whole NSA thing.
People.
Yeah, this whole NSA thing where they collect all the emails and all the information from U.S. citizens that come in and go out. When you think about it, it's so anti-democratic because, you know, they have all the emails of all the, you know, the Congress members and everything, and leaders overseas, you know, whatever, and it's great blackmailing material, you know. So I mean, anybody who, you know, so any sort of congressperson who or whatever. Not that I think I'm not saying that they wouldn't. You know, they've got lots of other problems with lobbyists and stuff, allowing lobbyists to pay them, you know, bought and paid kind of thing. But it certainly is a great, the NSA and all the information they have on everybody, it's a great blackmailing tool, and they can also just distort or whatever. So remember that, you know, that it's this surveillance thing, it's just crazy.
And it's also surveillance, you know, like the surveillance thing has gone really, really kind of crazy in the sense that there's more and more closed circuit TVs around the place. They're doing wonders with facial recognition to where you can start reconstructing people's face even if they have a mask. To vocal recognition, so you can pick up on their voice, to connecting through your TV sets, smart television. They can turn on the cameras. They can
probably
use microphones for all of your devices.
You've probably experienced, I don't know if you've experienced this, but like, for example, I'll give you an example. I was in the pantry and I mentioned something about a specific product that I must get, and it was totally, you know, a specific product. And I got back to my chair in about half an hour. It wasn't even half an hour. It was about 10 minutes later. That exact product came up as an ad on social media for me. And I hadn't Googled it. You know, I don't use Google. I try to avoid Google, but I wasn't searching for it anywhere, and I wasn't. You know,
didn't even have your phone in the pantry with you.
No, I didn't have my phone. It was actually
out in the main room.
It was out in the main room. So, you know, but it was obviously within a shot of, you know, microphone shot. And so, you know, like, and lots of people have experienced this, where the actual phone, your device, or your television, or the microphone on your computer or whatever, is picking up.
Smart houses.
Picking up. You know, like it's obviously got robot stuff that's picking up certain words, and then the next thing you know, there's an ad for it. So you know that's amazing.
It's
you know, and it happens to me now all the time. So what do? Do you put your smartphone in a soundproof box? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of it?
Yeah,
you know
you
what
can
I mean?
take your phone and you just pull the batteries out of it. But,
what do you do? You either cut yourself off.
And then it's not a telephone. Nobody can call you.
You either cut yourself off from the world, and then you don't really have much of a surveillance thing happening.
And then that becomes obvious in a different way.
That's right. Or exactly. Or you have to have. You know, or you just have to have these devices now. Almost, it's like, you know, and it's sort of.
Well, I mean, government here in Australia, government is cutting out almost anything paper or any phone interface.
Getting rid of public telephones.
They've gotten rid of public telephones.
Yeah, so you have to have it.
So you basically need a mobile phone.
Yeah.
basically can't get in touch with the government department, you can maybe call and get some of their endless menu loop things. But if you really want to check anything out or do anything, you have to go online, which is fabulous.
Yeah. Anyway, but we're sort of rambling, so we probably might wrap it up. Is there anything else you wanted to say about Wahhabism in relation to Saudi Arabia?
Thing, basically that particular jihadist movement came from Afghanistan, and when the Afghani war ended, the jihadists who had gathered from around the world wanted somewhere else to go, and so they were looking for other places, and they became a really useful tool. They were a useful tool in Libya, in Egypt,
they're a useful tool for the United
Syria,
the U.S. empire,
for creating problems for any country they want to invade, really.
Yeah. So if ever you hear of the United States government saying how much they care about women's rights and stuff, just remember that with Wahhabism, which they use as a tool, a political tool, is it's a distortion of Islam, and it's also a lot of Muslims reject it. It's a distortion, right? They're actually using it to oppress women. So whenever you hear the U.S. government saying how they care about women's rights, bunk 'em, basically.
Yeah. I wanted to just say one thing. You mentioned secular governments. I don't know how many people realize this, but Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, they were all secular governments. Gaddafi, Nasser, Assad, they weren't fundamentalist Islamic states. They were secular governments who were trying to develop. Almost all of those people were also involved in the creation of the non-aligned states during the Cold War, where they didn't want to be dominated by either the West or the East, either the U.S. empire or the USSR. They wanted to avoid any kind of colonialism and work for themselves and for the benefit. And that non-aligned power group has grown, actually, but they have very little power in today's world. But this was seen as a threat, and some of the earliest destabilization campaigns by the CIA was actually, one of the earliest ones was actually in Syria. I think it may still have been the OSS at the time. But,
what's the OSS, sorry?
The Organization of Secret Service, something like that. I don't remember. But it was the World War II version of the CIA.
Oh, yes, okay.
It's what became the CIA.
Yeah.
And they organized their first attempt at a coup was...
In Syria?
Syria.
Oh, was that their first attempt? I thought it was Italy in 1947 or something. The CIA?
I think...
Yeah, they started doing that in the 47 or 48. I think they were formed, in 48. And I think immediately after they started doing that.
This was before that. I think it was when it was still the OSS.
Oh, okay.
There's actually an interview by... a long time ago.
Okay.
And there's an interview by somebody who was involved in that on YouTube.
Okay.
Who was actually the person who was organizing that.
Oh, okay.
And he's come out, I'm sure.
Isn't it sad? Isn't it sad? Can you imagine all these countries without having had that CIA meddling and all that? In fact, even Australia, the CIA meddled in Australian politics and they probably still do a continuation of it, but in 1975 they admitted they removed our Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who after 18 months or something, and he was a democratic socialist prime minister, and it was really great with free education, free healthcare. He was great with indigenous rights and a whole bunch of stuff. And he was anti-war, and he was he didn't want, he was anti the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff. He was really, really great, and they admitted that they helped get rid of him. So, you know, we have an axe to grind. I have an axe to grind because he was a great prime minister and they got rid of him. And it's been downhill ever since. It's been neoliberalism slide since then, and it's death by 1,000 cuts. And that's why we need to get rid of neoliberalism. And of course, if you're on Real Progressives, you probably heard about MMT, modern monetary theory, which is just a description of the current monetary system. And it's very important that we all understand MMT because it can help all of us. You know, in Australia, Canada, United States, all over the place, any country that has a sovereign currency. So please look into that MMT, modern monetary theory. It's not a theory, it's just a description of how the current monetary system functions. And it will be of incredible benefit to all of us to understand that. Yeah. So anyway,
Office of Strategic Services, Lauren said.
Office of Strategic Services. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah. And Linda Carl was just saying, didn't Wahhabism purposely infiltrate the higher education system in Saudi Arabia?
In Saudi Arabia, there's a thing between the royalty and the ulema, which are the council of religious leaders, and the Council of Religious Leaders is able to set a lot of the social policy in Saudi Arabia. And that's the sort of deal they get so that they're not getting outraged at the excesses of the princes with their cars and their wealth and their wives and their sex workers and all of that sort of thing. And so they support this fairly corrupt state in return for being given very real social power.
Right.
And that includes the higher education system.
Right. There was this deal actually that the US made with the Saudis about it was a straight out deal, wasn't it? You give us the oil and we'll do the something or other.
Yes, basically they said,
when was this? This is way back.
Well, there's the original Aramco thing, which was the Arab American oil company. Yeah. And that was a deal for the oil, and they also agreed to back the Saudi regime.
That's right.
There were later deals that have come out.
So you'll notice the U.S. will never ever criticize Saudi Arabia because they made this deal, that they would support the Saudi regime, and it doesn't matter how nutty, how absolutely barbaric the Saudi, the Saudi family is in relation to the people.
Yeah. You'll never hear them talk about humanitarian abuses.
No,
you'll
never ever hear that. And the same with Israel.
Or democracy in Saudi Arabia.
And isn't it interesting? The two biggest allies of the United States are the Saudi Arabia and Israel, and both have extreme human rights abuses. So, anyway, that's the sad
Anyway, I just wanted to say that that kind of deal that they made with Aramco was only the start of the relationship. And you can read things like Diary of an Economic Hitman, which was a very highly publicized book a few years back. Yeah. I mean, the author, I've forgotten his name.
Was it Diary of an Economic Hitman?
Of an Economic Hitman. It was somebody who was
I remember
using the weaponized economics to control other companies. And part of the deal with Saudi Arabia is that they would make all this money in the oil, and they had to invest it in the United States. And the United States would then send their corporations over to develop Saudi Arabia, but it would all be done with American corporations. Right. So, it was linked in so many ways. And there's just been link after link after link. Right. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. Yeah. But part of the deal that they made with the Sauds is that they have to respect the deal the Sauds have made with the Wahhabi. Right. And the deal they made with the Wahhabi is they would allow the Wahhabi to set a lot of social policy.
And
things like
interestingly,
the way women are treated and so on.
And interestingly,
and
Mohammed
the fact
bin
that you
Salman,
can be killed for heresy.
Yeah, right. And atheists are thrown in jail.
Yeah.
And you know, gay people. And
Yeah.
Anyway, it's you know, you can find out. There's actually a great.
There was a recent thing where they were persecuting trans people who had come on Hajj pilgrimage from Pakistan, where trans people increasingly have rights.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a great Empire. I know I always mention the Empire Files, but that's because it's such a great program, and Abby Martin is such an excellent journalist. But she did a great program on Saudi Arabia, and I'll also put that in the information section. It's fantastic. But the Empire Files, EMPIRE Files, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful program. They bring out various things. It's irregular sort of releases, but it's excellent. So I'll leave a link to that because it's fascinating actually. But I think that's about all we were going to. We actually didn't intend to talk about Wahhabism, but Didi was mentioning Saudi Arabia. And, that's right, Mohammed bin Salman, he actually has been trying to do a deal, has he, with the Wahhabis?
Yeah, there's been a really interesting thing within in World Bulletin, which is the Turkish newspaper. They did a really good analysis recently of Mohammed bin Salman, and they talked about the fact that he's not really liberalizing. It's really more about consolidation of power. And because, you know, the king has so many mistresses, concubines and whatever, that there are so many sons and princes and what have you, and any of them might be in line for becoming the next king. And so one of the things bin Salman's had to do is cut their power base in a lot of ways, and many of them have been trying to do deals with the Wahhabi. And so in weakening the Wahhabi, he not only gets kudos by liberalizing a few things like allowing women to drive or allowing cinemas in Saudi Arabia.
Who gives him kudos for weakening the Wahhabi?
People in the West.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And also those people in Saudi Arabia who might want to see things become more liberal. Because, of course, there are people like that who would like to see less of a stranglehold on society by the fundamentalists.
Right.
It's just like the Taliban was certainly not universally popular in Afghanistan.
It just occurred to me too. Not occurred to me, but you know, Mohammed bin Salman obviously wants to make a lot of deals with huge corporations in the United States, and so if they sort of weaken the Wahhabi a bit, then there's lots of different things that he can probably do that wouldn't be so problematic because the Wahhabis weaken.
It also reduces the criticism by the West of Saudi Arabia, because it's really hard to justify any claim that the U.S. supports democracy or is interested in human rights when one of its major allies and major recipients of arms is Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy that has beheaded more people in a year than ISIS ever did, and has an absolutely atrocious record on human rights and
is
women's
committing a
rights,
genocide right now,
and is involved in destroying Yemen. The genocide in Yemen is inexcusable. And it's really hard to justify all of that. And I think by liberalizing, making some of these cosmetic changes, allowing films in and allowing women to drive, well, that's not any earth-shaking change.
No.
But he can be then seen as a reformer. And it also weakens the position of some of his his opponents.
And nobody seems to mind that he kind of like, he's been throwing all his relatives in, he's been locking up his relatives, or nobody seems to care. You know what I mean? This is just the amazing thing.
Killed and all
yeah.
Sort of,
and also nobody seems to care that most of the bombers in the 9/11 thing, most of the people flying the planes were Saudi. Were Saudi.
That doesn't mean they were government.
No, it doesn't mean they were government. But there's actually an ongoing suit against the Saudi government by the 9/11 family victims. And that's ongoing. But all of this, it's so funny. Here's Mohammed bin Salman in New York, where the 9/11 thing occurred, and there's a suit going on from the 9/11 family victims, and all these people were probably completely outraged, at the time, like Arianna Huffington and all of this, about when the buildings came down, but she's quite happy to sit around and make deals with Mohammed bin Salman. You know what I mean? Like, it's like capitalism. It just doesn't matter. We've got a collective amnesia when it comes to some things, and businesses don't care. If they can make a buck, great. They're happy to put behind them any sort of outrage they felt about buildings coming down or anything else,
It's easier to deal with one person who has that kind of overarching power than it is to deal with a democracy.
Really?
Because democracies sometimes want things to work for the people.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful at all. I mean, look at Venezuela.
Yeah.
That's a disaster. Look, they're trying to help the people.
Look what's happening to poor old to Lula. Lula, the ex-president of Brazil, and they've thrown him in. They're throwing him in prison for 12 years. No, I think it was Brazil.
I've forgotten.
Just look at some of the Telesur. If you want to know what's happening,
is great.
if you want to know what's happening in Latin America, subscribe to Telesur at TELESUR English. And it's fantastic. It really gives you an insight into what's happening in Latin America, and it's really quite frightening, the meddling that's going on there. It's seriously
but the history of meddling in Latin America is outrageous.
They're so fantastic. They keep resisting U.S. meddling, don't they?
Yeah.
Just keep on resisting U.S. meddling. That's what they do, and they really band together. The ones that, like, Colombia's not doing very well, but they really try,
Yeah.
And so anyway, we need to support these countries that are resisting U.S. intervention. We need to support Syria, and there's so many now, isn't there, Dee?
Yeah, and one of the things in so many of these cases, like in Venezuela, is because they're not allowing, global capitalism to have absolute sway. And of course, that was one of the big objections to people like Assad and Nasser and Gaddafi, is they were command economies. They said, basically, if we open ourselves to global capitalism, we're just going to be eaten alive.
Yeah.
We're going to be, poor people who might be used as really cheap labor while they just take all of our resources and give us virtually nothing. And they said, instead, we're going to try and use our own resources and keep control of it and get a decent price for it, and then use that money for our people. And that's why these countries have all had things like free education and free medicine and major housing projects and this kind of stuff. And
like
on the human progress indexes, those countries were very high.
Yeah, right.
But these facts that they had barriers to transnational capital. This was one of the big objections the U.S. has always had.
What's that?
Because the U.S. is basically a servant of transnational capital.
Yeah, I mean, Libya wasn't a bed of roses as far as, but Gaddafi actually had, I think he had some quite good social programs, didn't he?
Yeah,
and he
they had free education, including free university education, and they would pay for people to study abroad. They had massive housing projects, free
And look at it now.
building, transportation, communication, all of that.
And look at it now. That was unacceptable.
Yeah.
Unacceptable to the U.S., right? And Hillary Clinton, hoping this would make her look fabulous, destroyed that country, right? You know, the U.S. has destroyed Libya, made up more rubbish as to why to go in and invade, and then killed Gaddafi, a leader of a country, in the most hideous way, a really torturous, hideous way. I think they stuck a bayonet up his rectum or something. It was something dreadful. I mean, they absolutely... And then Hillary Clinton
filmed it.
Yes, and filmed it. And Hillary Clinton made a joke. We saw he died. I mean, just appalling. So, but Libya was actually, it wasn't a bed of roses, but it was doing quite well, thank you very much. And then the US went in, destroyed that country, and now they literally have it's just a failed state, and they've got slavery now. They've actually got people being sold as slaves. So this is just one example of U.S. meddling in a country and destroying a country, and now they want to turn Syria into that kind of thing, because it's very easy if you have managed chaos in the Middle East. You have these managed chaos in each country, so that you can do what the hell you want with them.
That's something that was in place from after the fall of the Ottoman.
And may I say, 40,000 people or more were killed in that Libyan, attack. It's just, or more.
But the managed chaos thing is something that goes right back to the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, when the British and the French got the chance to create these countries. And under the what was it?
The Balfour?
Sykes-Picot, but the agreement that they made, it wasn't the UN. What was it before the UN?
I don't know. Does
okay.
Know?
Anyway, the whatever it was before the UN, I've forgotten that organization's name. My memory is going.
I don't think I know that.
But they had created the situation where they said these people should be independent, and but they would give a mandate to France and England to manage those countries until democracy, not the OAS, Anyway,
never mind.
It was the they gave them a mandate to
League of Nations.
League of Nations, yeah.
Thanks,
Lauren,
thank you. Thanks, Dave.
The League of Nations created these mandates, and the idea was that they would become independent. But first, being primitives, they would need to be taught how to have a democracy. And so Britain and France were to be allowed to run the countries.
Don't you love that colonialist attitude?
The colonialist attitude.
The white man's burden.
And they could run the country up to the point where the people could manage themselves. And so part of the Sykes-Picot thing was the division of these countries into mandates like the mandate of Palestine or Syria or whatever, where they included disparate groups that were in conflict. When they created Iraq, they made sure to include both Sunni and Shia people and try and create conflict there so that they could keep managing it.
Right.
So they could keep control for
Isn't
the longest period of time.
Isn't it amazing, though, that here's these Western, like nations. The British nations, deciding how to arrange Western Asia. You know, I mean, this is colonial. Colonialism and Western imperialism has made such a mess, so much suffering, so much death. Let's not forget the indigenous people in various countries. In fact, I was just going to say, when we were talking earlier too, we were talking about how in Tasmania, basically, the British knocked off, just killed pretty much all the indigenous people, indigenous Aboriginals in this state. And we were walking along the river, and I just said, I often think about, I said to Didi, I often think about, Indigenous people that used to be here, and what, just wondering what it was like for them, so what the land was like. And that's an actually interesting talk we must talk about sometime with the people.
The genocide
Didi
in
knows.
Tasmania.
But Didi's spent time in some Indigenous communities in Australia, and she has some lovely stories. But anyway, sorry, you were talking about...
I was talking about Sykes-Picot and the creation of these nations, and not only the mandate of Palestine.
This was after World War One, or...
This is after World War One, when the Ottoman Empire controlled most of that.
Most of what?
Most of the Middle East. Basically, they controlled Syria and a big part of what is now Saudi Arabia, and was at that time 4 different kingdoms, and Iraq and Palestine and Lebanon. All of that was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
And so they gave Syria to France, and they gave Iraq and
This is amazing.
Palestine
Giving.
to England, and they also created Jordan. And the reason Jordan looks so unusual and funny is because it has that long stretch, and that was for the pipeline that the British wanted to run from Basra to through to Israel. Also part of the deal there was the Hashemite kings from Saudi Arabia, with Lawrence of Arabia and all of that, helped the British liberate that area. And part of the deal that they made was they would be independent, a deal which they really kind of cheated on. But they also made one of the Hashemite princes the king of Iraq, and one of the Hashemite princes they made the king of Syria, although they chucked him out. They didn't want him. And so they made him then the king of, king of Iraq, and they had another one who they needed a place for, and so they created Jordan.
Okay. Anyway, so they basically were putting people together that were, or had differences
of opinion,
so that they could keep interfering,
conflict, so that they could keep their control
and we all
under
know what,
the mandate.
And we all know what happened to Palestine.
And part of the whole thing in this was that the British had discovered oil in Iran in 1908, and they had also discovered oil in Basra. And this was at the time when ships, and the British Navy was, of course, the big thing, but ships had been run by coal, and they were starting to convert to diesel. And all of the oil was coming from America or from Russia near the Caspian Sea. So when they discovered oil in the Persian Gulf, this became a major thing for the British. And so they wanted control of that. And that's where they got control of a lot of the ducal states. And
what states?
The states, Oman, Abu Dhabi,
ducal states.
The ducal states, the Emirates.
Okay.
And they also made sure that Mosul was part of Iraq, so they could have control of the oil fields there.
Right, I see.
And a lot of that was about oil.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really
and it goes on, it's still about oil, isn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't really until World War I exhausted a lot of the energy and funds of the empire. Yeah. But Britain still had a major empire. But World War II really wiped them out in terms of having the money to run an empire. Yeah. And that's when the United States particularly moved into the Gulf and they had already moved in earlier in the 30s.
Yeah.
But they really moved in. The U.S., of course, also organized the coup shortly after they did the attempted coup in Syria.
Yeah.
They did the coup in Iran that put in the Shah.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was partly for Standard Oil.
Right, for Standard Oil.
Yeah.
In Iran.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, we've kind of been prattling on a bit, so we might actually wind this up now. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope this has been interesting. I've almost forgotten all the different things we've talked about. We've kind of meandered around, but anyway, we hope that's been interesting. And is there anything else you want to say, Dee Dee?
No, I don't think we can say anything else for the night.
All right.
Time.
Well, thanks, Lauren. Thanks very much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. This is Dee Dee River. I think we'll be back in a week or so to talk about some other topic. Actually, we had a topic we were going to talk about, and it was actually about sex work. And we thought...
that's interesting.
And that's interesting. But we thought maybe talking about this with all the serious stuff going on in World War III is more pertinent, so we'll wait, and in about a week we'll talk about sex work and some of the sort of the distortions about it. And what else... we don't want to go into it, but basically, you know, the
demonization of sex workers
and decriminalization, you know, the idea of decriminalization and all of that. So that should be very interesting, because Dee Dee has worked at a sex workers outreach project, and so she has a unique insight into that issue. So you know, that'll be interesting, and I think it's probably a perspective you don't hear very often, particularly in societies which can be so sex negative. So you know, it's a very good. It'll be an interesting perspective. So I hope that you'll look out for that one. Okay, all right. Well, thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. This is Dee Dee River, and you're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time.
See you, Linda. See you, Jack. See you, everybody.
Bye for now.
Bye.